Yeah, this is going to be a long video. Now, first impressions are everything, but sometimes you want to let something grow on you a little bit. Getting used to a new system, a new log curve, a new style of shooting, as well as getting used to new accessories not only comes with a couple of challenges, but also some learning experiences as well. This particular camera system we've talked about since NAB, and I finally got my hands on the Kinefinity Vista. We're showing you a little bit of footage right now, but I feel like there's so much more to this little pocket personal cinema camera. We'll get there. Hey, so a little bit of table setting here before we start this video. This is going to be one of the longer videos on this channel, but one thing, Kinefinity did send a bunch of us these cameras as beta testers, and they didn't really give us any plans on giving it back. So effectively, I get to keep this, and if it changes, well, then it changes. If that's a thing that makes you mad, well, then there's nothing really I could do for you here, to be completely honest. Second thing here is that this is a pre-production unit, and we have been working with pre-production firmware. At the time of this video, which is like a week before this video comes out, the firmware is so new, it's not even on like 1.0, I'm like 0.8 something. So some of these things are going to actually be fixed, and Kinefinity was kind enough to actually give us a roadmap as to when some of these features are going to be added. So if you're watching videos on the Kinefinity Vista and certain things aren't answered, it's because those firmware updates have not happened yet. However, the majority of it is actually planned to come out well before you even get it in your home. So today's video truly is a first impressions on pre-production firmware on a pre-production camera, because even the camera might look a little bit different when you guys get them. And if you guys want to know information about things that are coming up in future videos, just leave a comment down below. But I want to say one thing, Kinefinity sent us this camera. Hope that doesn't make you mad. You probably want to know about this camera anyways. And also some of the things I may say in this video might change between now and the next time I make a video, because they already told us things are going to change as we're doing this. So all of that. Now, we are going to revisit the body because there's a couple of things in here that I didn't get to cover while at NAB in the first video of this guy, and there's a couple things that you wouldn't have known unless you used it. For one, we're going to start off with the full frame sensor. Now, this guy over here, and I'm just going to do that whole, like, you know, that thing that it gets on everybody's nerves. This sensor is capable of shooting at 6K open gate up to 36 frames a second. You could also shoot at a 17:9 at 50 frames a second and 4K at 120 frames a second in Super 35. Now, frame rates we're going to leave for a separate video because I'm still working out the kinks onto this guy. I will mention that we are on pre-production units and firmware, so even the body is going to look slightly different from the models that you guys are going to get. And when I go and talk about firmware, and sometimes that feels like a cop-out, like it's super beta firmware, so the most I can get is a couple of images and show you guys what it's like using it firsthand. Now, this 6K sensor also has two things that you don't really see on other mirrorless cameras. For one, an OLPF. Now, what I know this to help out with doing is things like moire on textured images like suits, or if you're ever wearing like a thermal shirt, seeing some of those ringed artifacts that you might see on fabric might happen if you don't have an optical low pass filter. There's a couple other things that might have use cases for, and like you guys can leave in the comments, you probably know them better than I do, but you do have that on this camera. You also have the option of using IR cut ND filters. Now, this is something that doesn't get talked about quite a bit, but most cameras that are this size and price point don't have built-in NDs, which means when you use your own ND filters, when you turn it up to the max when you're shooting outside in the sunlight, sometimes the color of things like fabrics or tree leaves might actually drastically change because of infrared pollution. Now, a lot of filter companies have made a ton of money by making IR cut ND filters, but having that actually built into the sensor means that you can use things like ND filters or this built-in ND filter that you could attach onto the camera that has electronic contacts, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you're able to turn that up to the max without having any IR pollution by turning up the ND filters onto there. So those are two things that you don't really see or hear about that often that is in the Kinefinity Vista. Now, this might be a more trivial thing, but boot up time is a little bit weird on this guy because it's not going to be a fixed number. It's kind of relative to the last time you turn the camera on. If you go from cold, and this camera literally is cold to the touch, when I turn this guy on, it takes a couple of seconds for it to turn on. Like, I'm just going to turn on right now. I have an unofficial thing of when it's going to turn on for me. And when I turn it on from not turning on at all for a couple of days or a couple of hours, it will take a couple of seconds. It might take up to like 20-ish seconds to do this. But if I'm running gunning or I'm getting a couple of shots and I turn the camera off and I turn it back on, it's much, much faster. So in terms of the boot up time on this guy, it's relative to the last time you turned the camera on, which this is my first time turning the camera on today. So I'm still talking and it's still not on yet. It should be in a couple of seconds, but we'll see when that happens. Now, again, this might have to do more with the firmware on this guy. And also I'm opening up my notes. It's on now. So there, That's how long it takes for that to actually happen. The body also has a bunch of different mounting points onto here. What I like about them is that the mounting points also have RE locating pins. So if you're using things like magic arms in order to hard mount this to cars or different rigs, you have the mounting points where you do have the RE locating pins on the side and on the bottom, and as well as you have two on the top here, especially when you want to put on a cage. I also want to point out here in terms of the mounting points that you do have multiple screw holes for a tripod. Now, this might sound like a kind of insignificant thing, but when using a tripod plate, if you only have one screw, when you twist it, it starts to twist off and it's really friggin' annoying. But being able to have three of them actually on the bottom of here makes your life putting this on a tripod a lot more easy. You can go with a cageless design onto here. However, except for this part of the video, I've had a cage on this the entire time I've been making content on this guy. You get not one, but two HDMI ports onto here. They're at 1080p right now, but we did get a firmware kind of roadmap in terms of updates on things that are probably going to happen before you even see the camera in like real life after shipping or whatever. And it's nice to report that there's no HDMI lag onto this. Now, again, this is in 1080p and not 4K, where if it's in 4K, it might be a bit different because of the higher resolution, but there's two HDMI ports in case you need a second one. I know you kind of probably wanted SDI onto here, but you can't have everything. But you get both options on here and there isn't any lag. The screen is also going to be a big one as well. Now, it does that. It doesn't have the whole kind of hinge articulating thing that the S1R2, S1 II, and some of the other cameras have. And that also might be a function of the price onto here, which I didn't mention is $2,500 if you are looking to pick one of these guys up. Links in the description for the pre-order. But one of the things I'm going to say here is a thing that maybe got on people's nerves with this big old screen from the Nikon ZR is the inability to just flip this guy out and turn here because that microphone comes in the way. Now, this sits a little bit lower than the Nikon ZR does, and this screen also is more boxy, but a little bit shorter than the Nikon ZR is. But realistically, I could turn this just fine and put it back into here. It takes me a second to get used to. It's a bit of a learning curve onto this one if you're not used to having a big screen, but it is 800 nits, which is great for most situations. Maybe not as bright as what I would want it to be in direct sunlight situations, but 800 nits is plenty bright, and you can adjust the brightness in the menu settings. It's also going to be a touchscreen as well, so if you want to adjust different things like your settings or navigate menus, you can do that on the Kinefinity Vista without having to press any of the buttons. Which I also am going to point out that you do have 3 custom buttons onto here that are programmable. A quick press will give you one function, a long press will give you another, and you have a scroll wheel onto here to navigate your menus or to change the intensity of that built-in ND filter. And when I say built-in, it's more of an adapter that's electronic, but not many other mirrorless cameras have ND filters that you could attach onto here. The top of this camera has a cold shoe, not a hot shoe, so if you're looking to put in your DJI mics to have into here, you're probably not going to have a great time because it's not going to work. There's no electronic contacts in that cold shoe. There, I said it twice. It's something that you need to know. You also get the ability to write to a CF Express Type B card. You only get one of them, but you do have a built-in SSD drive. Now, it says 256 or something like that, but it's more like 229, which in 6K OpenGate H.265 420 max, which is the highest one you could shoot onto here at this current version of the firmware because the ProRes becomes available in 45 minutes, you're going to be able to get an hour and about 8 minutes on a single drive run. This also has to do with the battery a little bit later, but being able to get about an hour, close to an hour, 10 minutes, 6K OpenGate at 420 is nice, especially when you don't need a card in order to do that. And with the price of cards, if you like subtracted the SSD cost from the camera itself, it's like $100 more than the Nikon ZR, which is kind of a fun fact. And also a very important fact for later. We're going to talk about battery, which is going to be a short conversation because I'm not testing all 19 different frame rates and aspect ratios with the battery, but I'll tell you the highest one because it's stupidly long. Now, I tried using this by just recording to the SSD drive because I wanted to like kind of put in perspective how many SSD drives I can fill on a single battery. But with a fully charged one of these guys, and now this is the Kinefinity battery, I was able to fill the SSD drive, the 229 gigabytes of space, almost 3 times on this. In fact, I'm going to show you a montage of me logging how long this battery lasts on one of these batteries, filling it to the internal SSD. Just a quick battery life check-in. I ran this from 100%. Right now, I'm shooting at 6K OpenGate. The VND filter is connected, so it's drawing a little bit of power to actually have the electronic VNDs go. Shooting at 24 frames a second, recording to the internal SSD. And so far, we're at an hour, and the battery life is only at about 80%. This is the H.265 max. So this is the highest H.265 6K OpenGate, presumably 422. It doesn't actually say in the menu settings in this version of the firmware. And we have well over 60 minutes. So this is probably going to keep going until it's dead, but I'll check in a little bit later. I also want to point out is I've almost already run the SSD drive. The SSD is like 220-ish gigabytes of data that you get in there. So over 200 gigs of H.265 max is onto this guy. So I think not only is it cool that it has an internal SSD, but this is going to run for a pretty long friggin' time. Okay, so status update here. So we actually filled up the entire SSD drive. It probably got around like an hour and 8 or an hour and 7 minutes. So what I'm going to do is going to go into here and I'm going to go into my menus, recording, SSD, SSD media format. I'm going to format this and I'm going to just run it again and see how much longer we can get. So hour and 8 minutes will fill up the entire SSD drive. If you are shooting in 6K, open gate, H.265 max, you'll get about 229 gigabytes. So we're just going to run this again and see how it goes. And also just checking in, same settings, we are recording this and it's only at 50%. So about an hour and 8 minutes. I'm guessing if we do this for another hour and 8 minutes, you'll get about 2 hours and 16 minutes, which is a little bit less than the 4 hours I think they might have mentioned NAB, but this is also at the highest capacity setting. In this current version of the firmware, ProRes hasn't come out in a firmware update just yet, but that's pretty good. Another check here, we are halfway through the SSD drive, the second one, so we're about an hour and 42 minutes of record time. This is still the same setting at 6K open gate, and we're about, it kind of does this weird thing, and this is an early stage of the firmware. You guys just saw it went from 50 to 20, and it'll jump back up to 50, which means that I guess it's just going down a rung in terms of the level of battery. I'm going to keep running this until it dies, but an hour and 43 minutes is quite a long time. And yes, I reset this down to like 30 seconds so I can start it again. So that way it's way easier to track how long this can record for. Now, also keeping in mind, this is just kind of like a weird kind of first person angle here. I'm in a temperature controlled room. It's only like 70 degrees in here, so it's not going to overheat, which may draw more battery life. But if the claim here is that you're going to get way more battery life than you bargained for, like this is actually on the higher end from most cameras. Another check here, and we are just about to get to 2 hours. That is insane. I started this test at about 8 o'clock. It is currently 10:04. This is kind of nuts. I didn't think this would last this long. I thought it was going to die way earlier. And in other tests, which is weird enough, I've tried this again at 4.6K, like not even just before this test, and it got me like an hour and a half. I am just about at that 2 hour mark onto here in terms of recording. There's not much left on that SSD. There's maybe another like 15, 20 minutes left on this guy. And then we'll maybe go into the third one, but it does look like that battery will probably die. Like it'll go to 0%. It doesn't really go in individual digits. It'll go like 20, 50, 80, 90, 100. So it's a 2 hour battery at H.265 max, 6K open gate with a ND filter. You can kind of see that 0.75. There's the electronic ND that hooked up to this. It's hooked up to a microphone, but I mean the microphone's off because this version of firmware doesn't have audio just yet. But yeah, that's really freaking good. That's 2 hours. And again, I reset this time code clock at the beginning of the test. It had like a couple seconds, less than a minute. And that's really freaking good for a battery life on a compact mirrorless camera. We'll talk about other stuff that maybe people won't like, but that's a really freaking good result. And it's still going. It's still going. Okay, yeah, I know this is just a string of updates, but we're at 2 hours and 18 minutes. Like that's when it stopped for the second time. So it's about an hour and 8 minutes each drive shot. I filled it for a second time. There's still 20% battery. We're still shooting in 6K, H.265, max, open gate. The fan is on 30%. The screen is 50%. That is a really cool result. I've got to format this now and then like do it again a third time. So I'm going to go here. Actually, I have to go back to like recording settings. And like, it's right there. 6K, open gate, H.265, max. I'm going to go to my SSD. I'm going to format again. This is hard drive number 3. Now, maybe it's just better on battery life while doing this on your hard drive on the internal SSD, which is nice because it has an internal SSD. Most cameras don't have that. But the fact that you can get, this is my third round of 229 gigabytes to fill this up. And we just go again. Actually, no, I think it might have died. I think the battery finally died. Actually, nope. Let me try it again. I'm going to just turn this off and restart it and see what happens. Okay, so we're back on 20% battery, and we're going to just do it again. 2 hours and 18 minutes so far. Crazy. Okay, so this might be the final update. I accidentally pressed the playback button, and again, I'm on firmware 0.8. It's not even firmware 1.0 just yet, so this is incredibly early, but this is an extra 5 minutes. I actually turned it off at 10 minutes before, so technically it's like 15 plus 2 hours and 16 minutes. We're at 2.5 hours, and we're still on 20%. Now, it does sometimes flicker and give you like a warning when it's going to go down into a new battery level lower. So this kind of goes back and forth between 20 and 10%, which this might be my final update. It's also like 10:30. I have a sunrise shoot in like, oh, there you go. It's at like 10%. So right now, after all of this, same shooting modes, over 2.5 hours. Now, results may vary when you get your cameras. Other environmental factors will kind of figure out what's going to happen. But the fact that you can get 2 hours in 30 minutes and above because it's still recording, it's possible. Your external settings, like it's still only like 70 degrees in here. It's not super warm. I'm not doing too many things, but it is still running and powering that ND filter, which is electronic. It's connected to the camera. So this is really cool. Guys, I started this test at 8:03 p.m. It is 10:47. We're still on the same battery. I know I've put like 15 updates, but this is almost halfway, which means I can fill this SSD drive 2.5 times of H.265, shooting in 6K, shooting open gate on one battery. That is voodoo. And for people that practice voodoo, I'm sorry. That is voodoo. This, I'm going to go to bed. I want to go to bed now. I think I'm just going to go to bed. It's like 2.5 to 3 hours. There, that's the battery test. Now, this thing is still going. It's about whatever 30 plus 2 hours and 16 minutes is, which is like 2 hours and 48 minutes. But these are the settings I have. So battery warning is 6.0, which I actually don't know what that means. Low battery auto down. So I had it set so it doesn't turn off when the battery gets low. Fan speed is at 30%. Let me see if I could find where my monitoring, I can't turn my monitoring on right now, but right now it is, actually, let me see if I can do it here. Monitoring setting. Let me see if it'll show me what my brightness is onto here. It won't. So I got to go back into system. Built-in monitor. Brightness is at 50%. So if you guys are wondering, the brightness is at 50%. The fan speed is at 30%. You can't even really hear the fan. Like, it's pretty quiet over here. Also, I want you to also know that, like, man, if I could just open this up, I'm trying to do this one hand. This camera's not even kind of hot after 2 hours and 48 minutes of nonstop recording. Like, my thumbs in the back here, and let me just turn that ISO back up. My thumbs in the back here, this is cold. Like, I don't feel anything back here. That's 30%, fan on. This is closed, 2 hours and 48 minutes. Again, my house is temperature controlled, but if you're in a temperature controlled environment, like, that is nuts. And I honestly don't know who else shoots for 3.5 hours outside in the heat. We now got this down to 5% with, again, add like a 10-minute handicap on this guy plus the 2 hours and 16 minutes. 37 plus, we're almost at 3 hours. Again, I started this test at 8:03 p.m. It's pretty much 11. But we got a 5%, so at least we know how far the rabbit hole goes. Okay, so we have a little bit of a freeze here. Again, early firmware, but this is at 42 minutes after a 10-minute where I accidentally turned it off, and then 2 hours and 16 minutes. It says it's at 5%, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to try turning this off. And also, it's super dark in here because I gave up. I thought I was going to go to bed, and we're going to see how this works. I'm going to turn this back on now.
And this is red, so I'm assuming that means the battery, oh no, it's going back on. The battery is still not dead. Or is it? All right, well, for version very pre-production firmware, we have just over 3 hours of battery life. I can finally go to bed now. Oh wait, no, is it going on? So I don't know if this is just the camera crashing out, but the battery, I'm assuming, is dead. It's been on for over 3 hours, and it's now just making this like weird fan noise. I'm gonna try turning it off again, and let's see if it does give you a red light. I'm assuming that means that the battery is dead. It definitely does. Okay, well, we have 42 plus 10, that's 52, plus 2 hours and 18 minutes, which is about 3 hours and 10 minutes, shooting at 6K open gate H.265 max on this guy. So that's a really good result on here. I'm going to put this battery on the charger so that sound stops because the fan is going crazy.
Now, talking about the battery, I also want to talk about overheating. Now, it's not hot enough yet for me to do direct sunlight overheating tests, but inside of this temperature controlled room at about 70 degrees, the camera's not working too hard, which actually might contribute to the long battery life. This camera was actually really cold while we were doing things on it. The fan was only about 30%, but you do get the ability to go anywhere from 10 all the way to 110% increments, which is really nice. And I'll play a clip of how loud that fan actually is. But as far as overheating goes, I haven't experienced it even a little bit while shooting with this guy, including leaving it on at 6K open gate for 3 hours. Also, lastly, you do have two USB 2.0 ports on either side of this camera. Now, this is going to be important because you will be able to record on SSD drives later on, but also that's how you do your firmware update. So every time I have to do a firmware update on this camera, which in the beta testing period, there's like one every 6 to 8 hours. There's been quite a few. I do that through an SSD drive instead of using a memory card, which I don't necessarily know if that's good or bad. It is what it is. I think one of the big things here is that the form factor is very small. Also, this KineMOUNT, which we're going to talk about the interchangeable mount a little bit later, is a locking mount. So you can't put other adapters that are adapted for the KineMOUNT or the K-mount or whatever you want to call it. You could put it on the front of here and it's locking, so that way heavier lenses are more locked in to the sensor versus just kind of sitting there loose and full of juice. Or something else that rhymes with juice. I don't really know. That just came out of my mouth. I don't know. Speaking of the KineMOUNT, this is also going to be something that's unique because, well, I don't know any lenses that are for KineMOUNT. I didn't know that KineMOUNT existed, but also I didn't know that like Kinefinity cameras existed that much outside of like the Mavo Edge. But what I want to say here is that this is an interchangeable mount. Now, the mount itself is locking. I mentioned that before, which is super nice to get lenses actually fixed into the sensor so they don't fall out, and that, yes, has happened to me before. But what's nice about this is that you can actually choose a variety of different lens mounts with this guy by either adapting it directly to KineMOUNT or just taking the whole mount off and putting a new one on. You get the ability to use EF, PL, LPL, and even E-mount on this guy as well. And yes, if you open this guy up, there are electronic contacts onto here. These electronic contacts are not for autofocus yet. We asked about it. It's maybe on the table, but not in a way that you want to commit to it. So before you go into your Facebook and Reddit groups and say autofocus confirmed, I'm going to say, well, no, it's not. But it's not necessarily off the table or technologically impossible. However, those electronic contacts are great for being able to control things like the ND filter that you're going to be able to get onto here with the PL mount, or being able to control the iris on lenses that you do have iris control on. I can attach an E-mount to this camera and use E-mounted lenses and control the iris on the camera itself using those electronic contacts. And as well as, obviously, I already mentioned it, the cat's already out the bag, you could use PL mounted lenses and EF as well. Speaking of that, this is going to be the EF EV and D filter. Now, there's a couple of caveats with this guy. For one, this actually is going to start at 2 stops. So if you do want to get just 1 stop of ND, I would suggest just stopping down your manual focusing lenses. But one thing I will say is that it's super easy to get on here. Now, electronic contacts, which is super nice and very important to know. I could take this guy off of here. It'll take me like a second. The contacts go directly onto the camera itself, so that way you have control over it. And now you have an electronic VND from 2 to 8 stops for your manual focusing PL lenses. This is super nice to adjust your exposure, and exposure we'll talk about in a bit because I didn't know how to expose this properly to begin with. But you're going to get the option to control your exposure for up to 8 stops and as low as 2 on your PL mounted lenses. So if you're using things like the DZO Vespa 2s or the DZO Arcanas, maybe not the Typox because there isn't a VND just yet for the M mount for this guy, but you're going to get options. And also, fun fact, because I mean, this is $9.99 added to the camera. When you add these two together for $34.99, you get the smallest full frame END filter equipped cinema camera that I currently know that exists. There might be another one, but it is nice. I can also control the intensity of the ND on the camera itself, which is a little bit different from a Mofage Poco, but also super handy as well. But let's be all the way for real for like 2 seconds here. You did not come here to hear me talk about the camera body. You want to talk about footage. All right, so we're in the middle of doing our skin tones test. We're also testing some resolutions, but now you have to follow my sister. So I'm going to put her YouTube channel in the link in the description down below. But it's a thank you for her letting me drag her out to do this test. It's really boring.
At the crack of dawn.
It's 11:30. It's 11:30. It's 11:30.
Okay.
So admittedly, I'm going to just say this is my first time using KineLog 3. So there is a little bit of a learning curve here, but I'm going to talk about the resolutions, the frame rates, the aspect ratios, even using some of the color grading that's on here, and maybe a little tutorial. But let's talk about some of the image quality. Now, for one, you're going to get the option to have a ton of different options in terms of the things that you could shoot on the Kinefinity Vista. One, you could shoot at full frame, Super 35, Super 16, and Micro Four Thirds. So whatever lenses you have that you could adapt onto here, no matter what the sensor size that's going to be onto here, you'll have a variety of different options. Now, each of those are going to have different resolutions and aspect ratios, and also may affect your shutter readout, which we're going to talk about rolling shutter, but that's later. In full frame, you're going to get the option of shooting in open gate 3x2 up to 36 frames a second. You're also going to get the option of shooting 16:9 at 50 frames a second. And coming in later on, especially, like I said, a very immature firmware, we're going to get 4K at 120 frames a second. Now, frame rates are not going to be in this video because we are talking about fleshing things out in a first look, and I have that for later. That's all I'm going to say. It's for later. It hasn't been fully done up yet, but you're going to get the option of a bunch of different frame rates. However, you are going to be able to change your resolution whenever you want. If you want to shoot in 6K 16:9 or 5K 241 or 4.6K 6:5 aspect ratio, you absolutely can. And also you can shoot in anamorphic support, which is its own dedicated part of this video, but being able to shoot at full frame Super 35, Super 16, or Micro Four Thirds, which I don't know why you would want to do that, to be honest with you. I got a full frame camera. You have a variety of different options where you can shoot whatever you want. Codex wise, I'm also going to point out here is at the time you're watching this video, we got ProRes. We have ProRes 422, HQ, and LT. But up until like today, because this is the day before the firmware update, I was shooting at H.265 420. Now, you have 3 different flavors of those, and honestly, I can't really distinguish the difference between the 3 of them, if I'm being completely honest with you, but you do have 3 different flavors of H.265. Now, this is going to impact how much memory is going to take up on the camera or the internal SSD. So if you're someone who wants to save on a lot of space, you're going to be able to do that without a visual loss in image quality. Now, this is going to get compared to the Nikon ZR. So I'm going to show you what H.265 looks like on the Nikon ZR in N-Log, and what I'm going to show you is what it looks like beside KineLog. And what I'm going to say, if I'm being objective, the Kinefinity Vista looks a lot better. That's all. It's kind of there. It's the writing's on the wall there. It's kind of hard to avoid. Now, just to be fair, Nikon ZR also has internal RAW, which the Kinefinity Vista will not have. But the R3D beside the H.265 420 Max doesn't look that far off. I'm being completely honest, it doesn't look that far apart from each other where the world is going to come crashing down if I don't have RAW on the Kinefinity Vista. Now, I also am going to say that you're not going to get 444 on this guy either because it's a little tiny guy. Like it can only process so many things. If you want to pump in an internal RAW 444 image out of here, this becomes an explosive. And it's really hard to get cameras shipped into different countries as is. One that's explosive is going to make it even harder. Or it's going to make the shutter readout really, really slow. And that's going to make people even more angrier when we talk about rolling shutter. From an image and colors perspective, again, I mentioned I'm kind of new to this. I did find a way to get some sort of a decent image out of some of the things I was shooting. I did a bunch of test shoots. I'm like literally wedged in between documentaries, so it's kind of tough to get anything on like real jobs, but also given the firmware and how beta it is, I probably wouldn't take it to one right now. I'm able to get things that look great. I find the skin tones look awesome. And also I will say that when you combine the camera and the lens choice and the location and your lighting and your wardrobe and your talent and all the other stuff that don't diametrically oppose a camera purchase, things are going to look really good. And it's just nice to say that on the Kinefinity Vista, they look really good. Skin tones look great. It doesn't feel like there's a bunch of sharpening or noise reduction built into the image of the camera. Although the data rates are variable in H.265 420, and some people kind of poo-poo on 420, I'm able to get an image that looks really good out of it. Now, if you need more than that, you could always use ProRes, but that's going to come at the cost of data. It's going to cost you more data, and we already know how that's going. But being able to get a decent image quality at a small file size out of an even smaller camera, I have zero complaints about that. Like at all. I also love the fact that you do have anamorphic support, because why would you have open gate and not anamorphic support? Canon R6V, same price. Okay, I'll calm down. You're going to get the option of being able to de-squeeze at 2 times and 1.5 and 3.33 or 1.33, and as well as you get the option for vertical anamorphic as well. If you want to shoot in vertiscope, you could actually take a 1.5 times squeeze lens like the Digital Arcanas and go to 0.67 in order to get a different aspect ratio and get more height out of your image, which also is kind of cool because we will talk about that a little bit later when we talk about rolling shutter. Because when you go back into those resolution aspect ratio modes, different ones are going to have slightly different readouts getting faster as you crop in on the sensor. However, if I needed more height, because 2:4:1 is a very thin, long aspect ratio, being able to use vertiscope will actually give you more height in the inverse direction. So if you need something that looks more like a 4:3 or 6:5, I don't actually know the aspect ratio, someone will tell me, you'll be able to get that shooting in vertiscope. That's important for later. Also, keeping in mind that if you just need a more square size deliverable, but you also are shooting in 16:9, you can use it for that as well, at the cost of having vertical anamorphic flares. But if you don't care about that, or if you don't have a lot of flares in your image, it's kind of Bob's your uncle. You don't really notice or care. Now, the hard part about KineLog 3 is actually the fact that I use DaVinci Resolve, because at this current junction in time, there is no color space transform for KineLog 3. I don't even know what the color space is. I kind of feel like I'm guessing a little bit, but when I asked around, the closest thing that was compared to it was RELog C, which is interesting because I'm shooting on RELog C3 right now, just on the Lumix S1 II. And now that I think about it, the 420 RELog C 6K open gate should look the same as using it on the KineLog 420 6K open gate. Yeah, it doesn't. I actually have a LUT specifically built for the RELog C on the S1 II. It doesn't look the same on the KineLog 3. Now I'm going to transition into like a little color grading tutorial about how I got the most out of the image out of the Kinefinity Vista, because as someone who still technically is a working professional, one thing that I would do with my images as a professional is, one, I would light it because that's just a smart thing to do, but also I'd probably grade it. And also I couldn't find a Rec 709 LUT that I thought that was accurate or that worked, so we're going with this instead. Now with KineLog, I heard it was close to RELog C, so I do have a LUT that I use for the RELog C3 on the S1 II, S1 R2. The reason why I use this LUT, because it was, in my mind, the closest thing I could find in terms of a 10-bit RELog C 420 open gate capable file. Doing that, it doesn't necessarily look the way that I want it to. There's a couple things that I need to change up here, but also there's some flexibility in terms of the files that we can use here. For one, I am going to need to balance this out, and I'm just going through the nodes that I did use, so that way you guys can get an idea of what I'm looking at here. So I balance this guy out. I'm trying to get rid of some of that purple that you're going to see, and a lot of the images had purple in it, so I try to go a little bit more on the green side. I pumped up my saturation, so that way the skin and all the other colors boost up. Now this actually starts to look a lot better. Like this and this are kind of totally different. And one thing I learned about KineLog is that it is super flat and desaturated. So having to pump up my saturation is pretty much what I did across all of my grades here. Now, there is a little bit of stuff into here, so I want to try to bring down some of my highlights, and I'm going to go over to my HDR And with this, I could actually see that out of the window. Now, if you're looking at that, there's not much more out of here. There isn't so much dynamic range. I could see a clear cloud out of here, and I kind of don't need to for this shot, but being able to bring down a little bit of some of the highs, bring down a little bit of information into here. Now, truthfully, because this is all kind of flat line down here, I could bring that up, and I do that in my curves. So we're in our curves here, and I've actually used this to bring this up and down. And you can play this to taste. Like if you really want to try to expose for some of the shadow areas, you can. I kind of like it down to here. It's a lot more moody. And then I finish this off with actually putting a gradient against where the shadow is. So right over here, if you see it on this side of the image is unaffected. This side, I brought up some of the darks. What's nice about this is that you do have a little bit of flexibility into here. So I can bring up some of my darker areas. And like if we zoom in, it's pretty clean, even in that 420. And that's going to be kind of the first run of me doing this. So again, this is kind of a quick and dirty. I won't even say this is like the official way to grade KineLog. I'm still learning this thing, but this is one of the grades that I did and how I figured things out. So let's turn everything off. That was my LUT that I usually use on RLog C footage. Does not look that good. I balanced it out and it's a bit more green now. Pumped up like 75 saturation, which I think it really needed. Brought down some of the highlights for a more moody image and also bringing down some of the highs. So I try to avoid this clipping, but this right here is actually that over there. Curves, I brought up some of my shadow information, and then I made a power window gradient, which if you want to see the mask for that, it's right over here. And I could like move this up or closer however I want. But that is our first little grade. Okay, let's go into our second grade here. And I clearly don't learn my lessons because turning all of this off, I did use that RLog C LUT again. And again, it just doesn't look the way that I want it to in this image as it would if I was using RLog C3 on other cameras, but I have nothing much really to go off of. But what I did here is I immediately went to my saturation here because the constant thing I'm learning on KineLog is that I personally, for my grading style, I got to pump up my saturation. So that has actually pumped up to 70%. I go to my DCTL, and this is a free tool. I've talked about this guy before. This is called Tetra. You can Google this one. I think Loris is the guy who makes it, but I wanted to just pump up the red specifically, move that red channel into a favorable place where I could change my tint. And that feel like I could probably do that all in the DCTL. But I tried it onto here. It's just the way that I did it at this current junction in time. And then what I did was similar to the previous grade. I added a little gradient for the shadow that's going to be over here, and I can move this farther or closer. And that was just to bring up some of the details that's going to be in the hair. And I mean, for 420, it looks pretty decent. Like if I zoom in on some of these finer details, it looks really good. Now this is like 6K 241, I believe, but this is a pretty solid image. And then just for fun, just to see what would happen, and I want you to look closely, I added some mid-tone detail. Now I turn that on and you see a little bit of some pop in some of the darker areas here. If I turn that off, then it's gonna look like this. And the reason why I added some mid-tone detail is because I actually using a short slash everyday filter to bring down some of the highlights that would come from the key light on this side. And I mean, I've talked about that ad nauseum of the channel. You guys already know about that, but I could turn that off and on just to add a little bit extra into the darker areas. It doesn't do too much, and you shouldn't add too much, but putting that at like 15 to 20, it looks really good. So I'm gonna turn all of this off. And then we're gonna go again. So our LUT, our saturation, our DCTL, our tint, where this call could have been an email. I probably could have just made that one thing. My shadow, and then mid-tone detail. And that looks pretty good. And again, in today's episode of Kofi not learning his lessons, we're gonna go through, this is actually the first grade that I did. This shoot day was way before the other two. But again, I want to figure out how to make a KineLog LUT as I go with this. RLog C is going to go onto here. And again, it's flat. It looks desaturated. I feel like there's more color that should be put into here, but I haven't figured that part quite out yet because I don't learn my lessons. So I pump in a bunch of saturation. Now that looks a whole lot better, but then our white balance was kind of off. Like this is more of a magenta warm tint. I don't like that either. So again, I'm just going to go back to saturation here. This is at only 65 instead of like a 70 or 75. And then I'm going to go into here and I'm going to white balance myself. Now that looks a bit better. That looks kind of more realistic. And also like, this does look a little bit like a more higher end camera. Like this particular shot, I actually really like this. Maybe it was just a composition, who knows? And then we add our DCTL in, and you can see that over here. And I literally only added like 0.07 to my red channel because I just wanted the skin tone to pop a little bit more. It's in the right range, it just needs more saturation. And then I added a curve, and the curve is going to be right here where I just brought up some things in the middle just so it makes things a bit easier. Now this, again, quick and dirty grades. One thing I learned about KineLog across the board with all of these guys is you are going to need to pump up a little bit more saturation. If you guys are interested in this LUT, it's just the Lumix S12 Arilog C LUT. You'd have to make these adjustments pretty much every time, so I can't guarantee you it's a one-click solution, but it is useful. Now, the fun thing here with working with a different camera is going to be trying to figuring out exposure and dynamic range, because both of those two things are going to go hand in hand. Because if you expose them properly, it's hard to talk about dynamic range because you operated the camera like an idiot. I'm idiot. Now, I'm going to talk about this because it's a little bit complicated, but you do have a dual base ISO at 850, 120. Kind of a weird number, actually, now that I think about it. But in terms of dynamic range in either situation, it's solid. It's not super, super high, and I didn't expect that for $2,500, but it's also not unusable, which is really nice. My litmus test is realistically, if I have a single light in a situation and I have my subject that's lit, and then also can I see it out of the window? If I can do that, I'm perfectly happy in like 99% of situations. However, Kinefinity throws you a curveball with this whole thing called highlight tuning. Now, again, me, noob to Kinefinity stuff in general, so some of you might know this a little bit more. But there's a number beside the ISO while you're operating on the camera. Now, this number might say like 6.0 or 4.3 or 7.3 or whatever the case might be. And my assumption is that those are the stops over middle gray you could be overexposed in that KineLog will be able to decipher the information from. So for example, the lower the number is, the less stops over middle gray, the less highlight information you'll be able to pull back from an image. And the higher that is, well, the more of it, obviously. Now, keep in mind, this doesn't mean that I could increase and decrease my dynamic range. If it's 11.8 stops or 12.3, irrelevant. But what you could do is you could shift it going forwards and backwards. It's kind of like CineEI, except the Kinefinity Vista actually commits to it because it changes what the image looks like. So for example, if I shoot at 800 ISO at 4.3 highlight tuning, I'm going to have a bunch of information in my shadows. My blacks are going to look clean. Highlights, not so much. Things like windows and clouds, not going to look that great. It's actually going to look kind of wild. It's going to look blown out. However, at that same ISO, if I go to 7.3, which actually switches the ISO base from 800 to 1280, you're going to go the opposite direction. You'll get more out of the highlights, but it's going to take a little bit away from those shadows. Now, 1280, that's not necessarily where the most amount of dynamic range is because you're not at the base ISO. So you got to go up to 5120 and then ND filter your way down. But also when you still need more highlights, it's going to give you the best chance at your dynamic range. The only way I can explain this in an example is that if I use a high highlight tuning, I could see things out of a window, but the blacks and the dark parts are so noisy that it almost looks crunched and like purple fringy. However, on the flip side, if I want to get nice and clean darker parts of my image, don't count on being able to see out of a window. Those are my best ways to explain it. Again, this is a first look, and I'm going to start to learn more things as we keep going on. We've only really had a collective like 8 days with the camera, but that's how I learned how to expose, which also impacts my opinion on the dynamic range because there's not much I can say because I don't have the whole Xylo chart thing. I just know that it's solid. Okay, are you seated? Good. You're sitting down? All right, cool. Put your pitchfork down for like 10 seconds because we're going to talk about rolling shutter. And it's going to make you potentially upset if you're someone who's super affected by rolling shutter because a Kinefinity Vista doesn't have a fast rolling shutter. In fact, it's probably quite slow. Now, I have nothing to compare it to except for the Nikon ZR, which I had with me while I was testing the camera. And the Nikon ZR, even when I swing my camera back and forth like a maniac, it doesn't feel like the image is trying to catch up to where I left off the last swing and catching up and going back to the other one, if that makes any sense. You don't get the jello wobbly lines, at least not as much as using the Kinefinity Vista. Where if I use the Vista, if I'm to guess, it's probably in like the 20 to 25 millisecond range. Now, I'm going to be fairly consistent here. Most cameras in this price point don't have great rolling shutter results. If I'm comparing it to the Canon C50 or the R6V or the R6 Mark III when shooting an open gate, I think that's more than 15, but like less than 20. The Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K is in the 20s. The Pix is 12K at 12K. Is in the 20s. The Sony A7C II, FX2, A7 IV are also in the high 20s, close to 30. The S1R2, even without using the dynamic range boost, also in the 20s. There's a bunch of different cameras that are in the 20-ish millisecond range of your readout. The S5 IIX, the S5 II also are in that range as well. What I'm trying to say here is that it would be inconsistent for me to point out that one camera's rolling shutter is particularly bad and then completely ignore that the other ones are not that much different or better, while also keeping my expectations matched up with the price pretty consistent. In fact, the sub $3,000 kind of category, the only two cameras I could think of, or three cameras that are a fast readout speed per se, would be the S1 II, the Z6 III, and the Nikon ZR. Maybe the R5C, but I don't really know. But everything else is not the fastest in the world. Now, I said all of this not only to show you some of the B-roll of the different aspect ratios, but one thing you might notice is as I window down on my resolution and aspect ratio, given the same frame size or the same sensor size, the rolling shutter gets a little bit better. Now, it's not by a gigantic margin because I guess you're only just taking off like fractions of the resolution. But one thing that I'm noticing, if I give the sensor less things to read out, the faster it's able to read out those things. So the difference between say like 6K open gate and like 5.7K 241 might have a different readout or a different look in terms of the jello lines and trees and stuff like that. Now, in this example, I try to normalize everything to 241, so that way the aspect ratio stays consistent and we're not tricked by being able to see more or less of the image. But as I window down, it gets slightly better. It also gets slightly better if I start to window down in terms of my sensor crop. So if I go from full frame to Super 35 to Super 16 to Micro Four Thirds, the readout gets a little bit better. Now, that one's kind of a tough one because I only had one lens and it crops in a little bit, but I will also say flip side, if you use longer focal lengths, you're going to notice rolling shutter quite a bit. If I use a 75 millimeter, you're going to see jello and it's going to make you sick. Or if I use say a 16 millimeter, you still see it, but it's just not as jarring as using a 75 millimeter, at least in my opinion. Now, with all of this, and before you guys run to the Reddits and Facebooks, and I don't know what you're going to say, and I kind of don't care. Two things that might be saving graces is one, gyro stabilization does sometimes help with rolling shutter artifacts, or at least it did on the Blackmagic cameras, especially on the Cinema Camera 6K, which is a way that you can combat the rolling shutter. That is going to be in a future firmware update that they've already mapped out is going to happen somewhere between pre-launch or shortly after the launch of the camera. And also, it's not new software like other cameras have the gyro stab, so you should be able to fix certain things. The second thing is when I actually talked about the first bit, which actually means that you crop down on the aspect ratio and the resolution to get more readout speed. Now, I tried to do this coupled with using vertical anamorphic lenses. So I did actually go to that 0.67 on my Dizito Arcana 45mm 1.5 times squeeze. And yes, it gives you more height in terms of your image. And then I did the whole swinging like a crazy person act. And well, there's a thing that I noticed, and it might actually have fixed some things. However, it introduced a new problem, which is more a problem with the lens in the fact that there's barrel distortion on the sides of the lens. So when you turn it vertically, and now it's on the top. So when you do that rolling shutter test, well, now you're seeing distortion and still a little bit of rolling shutter, which is hard to quantify whether or not it works. I'll let you guys figure it out in the comments if that actually helped anything. However, if you're someone who's very affected by rolling shutter or triggered by it, this might not be a camera for you. There's other cameras that are going to be fast and have faster readouts. They're just probably going to cost more money. Now, I mentioned before you do have a dual base ISO at 800 and 5120 respectively. Now, if I could only get my shots in focus, this would be a lot easier, but being able to use this at that 6E, which is basically how many stops over middle gray you could expose for, one thing when you put them side by side is a 5120 is going to have a little bit more noise. Now, I want to make a note of this as well, because using that highlight tune is also going to dictate your shadow information. I overexpose both of these images by a couple of stops in order to see what the shadows are going to look like, what the noise is going to look like. And when you do have a higher highlight tune, it might look like an absolute mess. So even as you go higher to your second base ISO, you still want to be cognizant of the idea of how much in that highlight tune you're going to use. Now, like I mentioned before, if you want to get more shadow detail, you might want to make that a lower number, even when you're sitting at that second base ISO. Things are going to end up being a little bit cleaner. Now, when trying this out, even at 800, which is naturally going to be a lower ISO, have cleaner shadows, being able to use a lower E value might help out a little bit where you can, where it's not super underexposed. And then where I find a sweet spot is if I am in a low light situation, shooting at 5120 with an E of like 4.3 seems to be the spot where I could find the most exposure, but also trying to protect my shadows and keep them clean. This also requires a lot more testing, but I'm currently in a car driving to Montreal at 3 a.m. So I want to take a second. I want to talk about accessories and the ecosystem of the Kinefinity Vista, because this entire camera package outside of the lens and the microphone, I can just get on Kinefinity's website without having to go through third parties. Now, my Amazon check at the end of the month, my B&H affiliates really do like it when you guys buy the things that are in the rig builds in some of the videos I've made here. But one of the things that might be a little bit more annoying is scrounging through the internet to find some of your rig parts. Kinefinity actually gives you the ability to pick out the accessories that you might need per camera right on the website. So when everything gets delivered, it's delivered at the same time. Now, we're going to start off with a couple of different accessories, but I'm going to start off with talking about the KineMOUNT, or K-mount is what I'm going to call it for the rest of this video. And the K stands for Kofi now. But KineMOUNT doesn't actually have any native lenses. I've never heard of a Kine mounted lens before, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, but it's incredibly adaptable. Now, you're going to get a couple of different options on their website. The ones that I have is actually going to be the Sony active mount to the K-mount. Now, you do have the electronic contacts onto here, and no, it's not for autofocus. It's more to control aperture, and that way your lenses can communicate directly into your camera. Now, this you actually have to mount onto the camera, so you do have to take the screws off the Kinefinity Vista, put this guy onto there, and that way you could use all your E-mount lenses. I'm also able to use my E-mount to M-mount adapter, so that way I can use things like my Typox Samara Cs. And the 16mm just came out, and I made a video on that already. Another thing that's really cool as well is you can get a K-mount to PL mount. Now, I talk about a lot of PL mounted lenses, the Vespa 2s or the DZ Arcanas or the Nisi Aureuses, or just generally I have a lot of PL mount manual focus lenses, and being able to get one of these guys without having to go through Amazon and hope to God they ship to Canada, again, you can get this all in one package. I also want to keep in mind here, these all don't just come with that $24.99 price tag on the Kinefinity Vista. These are things you're gonna have to go on the website and figure out which ones that you need. However, it is really nice that it's all in one place. Now, speaking of this guy, and this is gonna be one of the big ones because we were asking this from other companies who also make cameras to have for a long time, and they didn't do it. But there is technically a way that you can get a built-in ND on the Kinefinity Vista. Now, I am hoping to see other brands still make Kinefinity Vista accessories, but things like your cages and your top handles, you could also get in a package on the Kinefinity website. They actually did team up with Tilta, which gives you a really cool wooden side handle, which is really nice. It's kind of innovative. Like, this does kind of give it a flair where I can keep everything kind of in one spot. I'm able to hold this to the side. It does pass the hand test, which is really nice, but it still keeps a nice and compact package. Now, the top handle is actually pretty decent, but also a little bit weird because you do have a battery mount you could put onto here for accessories that you might have that you want to hook up into the battery, especially if they're USB powered. You do have two PD ports that are going to be on this handle as well. So if you want to power things like monitors, which does draw from USB power, some of them do and some of them don't. And also Kinefinity's own accessories will work on the PD handle. So you could get more than the package that I have here. You could actually get things that are specifically for this camera. The only caveat being is that if it dies, you have to turn everything off and then turn everything back on again, but that's nor here nor there. On that top handle as well and on the cage, you're going to get a variety of different mounting points. The Kinefinity Vista already has a ton on the body itself, and the Tilta cage where they teamed up with, and I'd argue maybe they teamed up with Tilta on the handle, but it's not written here anywhere, but you're able to get more than enough mounting points on this camera in order to get a variety of different accessories. Also, one of the most underrated things that Kinefinity sent over was their screwdriver. This is the thing I didn't really know was important, or did I need it, and also the little drill bits for it, because when I'm taking rigs off or I'm taking off mounts and putting things back on, this has been super clutch because it's motorized, and it also has a little fancy light. So if you're in the dark, you're able to see things. So Again, this is kind of random, super underrated, honestly, in my opinion. I'm going to keep this in my camera bag whenever I need stuff for this camera because there's so many accessories that I do have to change things over a lot because I'm testing the camera. We're literally the guinea pigs for this company. Now, yes, Kinefinity gave us a bunch of cameras to beta test. I don't see a return label in the box. In fact, I think I threw out the box. So if there's a return label, I have no idea. I'm keeping this thing now. So it makes a lot of sense for me to point out downsides outside of the rolling shutter, which I feel like is going to be a hang up for a lot of people. But there's other things that if you're expecting this from this camera, you're not going to have a great time. For example, autofocus. If you're expecting autofocus out of the Kinefinity Vista, they've never had autofocus before, so I wouldn't look at necessarily having it right now. It's a cinema camera, and like they're branded personal cinema camera, but it's still cinema camera nonetheless, which traditionally doesn't have autofocus, and when it does, it's more of a bonus than it is a requirement. I would love to have it because it's something I can kind of take on my hip for things like that, but I also have manual focus lenses for the most part, so I wouldn't know when I would use it. Now, just to reiterate, those electronic contacts maybe can be used for autofocus at a later time, but before, again, you go into the forums and say autofocus confirmed, Kinefinity can't verify nor not verify that, so they can't really commit to having it come out anytime soon. Theoretically, maybe, but no one knows. The second thing is we mentioned gyro stabilization before, but the camera itself doesn't have IBIS. Now, there's varying conversations and arguments for or against having IBIS. Personally, for me, as someone who does car mount stuff from time to time, I would prefer not to have IBIS. Or if I want to use this as a crash cam, a robot camera, a gimbal camera, sometimes IBIS can get into the way where it might shift one way when you're trying to move the other way, and added to a not so fast rolling shutter readout, that could cause a bunch of potential problems that make you even angrier at some of the readout speeds and how the image looks when you're shooting in handheld. However, again, they clearly told us, I mean, I can't show you the file, but there clearly is going to be a gyro stabilization add-on into a firmware update, I think well before you guys even get the camera anyways. There also isn't going to be internal RAW or internal 444 because, like I mentioned before, it would turn this thing into an explosive. That's a lot of processing capacity, and if we didn't have any overheating issues up until this point, it might cause some being able to process that much data at the same time. Also, we tried putting RAW into a smaller compact mirrorless camera before, and we all got really upset that the data rates were super high. It would probably be no different on the Kinefinity Vista, if I'm being honest with you. So though that might be a fault for some people, I'm not surprised because I don't think the target market was made to use internal RAW or ProRes 444 on a camera that's this small without it getting really hot. And the only other downside that I can point out, and this is not necessarily the most fair assessment in the world because it has to do with firmware. There are still features that have yet to be actually added into the Kinefinity Vista that plan to be. When we got the cameras, we got a whole spreadsheet of different dates and different updates that are coming out. And everyone who's making a Kinefinity Vista video right now is effectively a beta tester, in which this is kind of a little bit of a different thing where it's not like it's an embargo release for like a Sony camera where the camera is like pretty much completed. We are seeing this thing from like the earliest version of the firmware because when I got this, you couldn't even record clips on it. And even today, audio doesn't work on it. We're literally getting updates every 8 to 10 hours and probably will for the next 16 to 18 days. So this firmware is so early. Like you guys are going to get it when it's at version 1.0, maybe like 1.1. Like if I show you this right here, let me just kind of see if I can get that like plugged in there. This is version 8.4, or sorry, this is version 0.84. That's how early this is. There may be 16 different firmware updates before you guys get the launch version of it, which means it's going to add in a bunch of things. We already know that ProRes is on today and different audio functions and different even shooting modes and something called a sensor readout mode, which I don't know what that means, but hopefully it comes out soon, is going to be added in a little bit later, giving this a first impressions and probably like a part one of like maybe 5 or 6. I also want to point out the price, if it hasn't been mentioned already, but I'm sure it's probably been leaked already, but it's going to be about $2,500. Now, there's a bunch of different kits that you can get, and if you want to pre-order them, if everything jives with you and things that are coming out, or you really like the image and you like the size and everything else, the link's in the description down below. Truthfully, yes, I get an affiliate commission, but it's not that much that I'm not clamoring for you to buy a camera that you don't need. But one of the things I'm going to say is that at $2,499, try not to be a victim of your own expectations. I think every time a new camera comes out, we have sort of this whole thing. I want to call it Avengers Endgame syndrome, where every movie that came after Avengers Endgame gets compared to Avengers Endgame, despite the circumstances. I don't know if I was expecting a global shutter 6K open gate full frame interchangeable mount built-in ND camera for less than $3,500. I don't think that's ever going to exist. Are there some things that the Kinefinity Vista is missing that I would love to have? Absolutely. And as new firmware and updates come out, we'll get into that in future videos. However, in the price point that it currently occupies, there's a lot of things that it can do that other cameras can't do. For one, there's not a ton of cameras that have interchangeable mounts where you could literally take off the mount and put a new one on, and a company that's working towards having all of them. This is the cheapest way to get built-in NDs on a compact mirrorless camera that's electronic and can communicate with the camera itself. There's not a lot of cameras that shoot open gate or have anamorphic support not only for your horizontal anamorphic, but also for vertiscope as well. This is also going to be able to record to an external SSD drive. You have 2 full-size HDMIs where some cameras don't have one. The screen is gigantic. There's things that are going for it that make it different from other cameras and not necessarily better than the other one. So for everyone that's going to ask me to buy this or an FX3 or this or an Icon ZR, I don't know. No one knows. The whole point of the video is that you have information, you have your own needs, that you've written down. I hope you've written them down. And then based on all the information that you have, you make a purchasing decision. And if it doesn't fit all the boxes, whether it doesn't today or it doesn't tomorrow or it doesn't in like 3 weeks, buy it. And then we all just kind of have fun talking about things that we're interested in, which is my bid for everyone just to be respectful in the comments, which probably isn't going to happen. But anyways, that's a rant. That's aside from anything else. But what I want to say here is so far my first impressions on the Kinefinity Vista, solid camera, great price, a lot of modularity, maybe not something everybody asked for, but for some people it might be a really handy tool depending on your circumstances, like every other camera that's ever existed. Okay, yep, I'm going to have like 4 more parts of this guy, but we'll talk to you guys in the next one. Peace. Also, I won't be at Cine Gear. If you're looking for me, you're not going to find me. If you see Justin Porter, just call him me. That works out, right?